Just want to welcome everybody to this webinar that we've organised. It's a feedback on the Hiroshima and Nagasaki anniversary events that took place in Japan, and our delegation of Jeremy and Caroline. So it's feedback from them. So we're just waiting for people to join the meeting. It's very, very popular. So we'll just give it a minute for people to join. Okay, so thank you so much to all of you who are joining us this evening. So I'm Sophie Bolt. I'm the General Secretary of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. So it's really lovely to be here with you. So obviously commemorating the 80th anniversary of the US atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is an absolutely critical part of CND's work, which is about raising awareness of the terrible human cost of nuclear weapons. And, this has never been more urgent, has it? Given the growing nuclear threats across the world, our own government's nuclear expansion and its preparations for war fighting readiness. And we know how critical it is to draw attention to the terrible reality of nuclear war and to share the powerful testimonies of the Hibakusha, the survivors of this horrific war crime. So in July, CND was really deeply honoured to host Kyoko Gibson, a second generation Hibakusha, at our parliamentary meeting then. And if you haven't already, you can watch her very, very moving testimony describing the trauma of growing up in Hiroshima just 3 years after the bombing, which was featured in our 80th anniversary short film. And Rachel Erlington, our parliamentary officer, who's doing the tech behind the scenes there, has just shared the link to that film. So please do watch that if you haven't already. But also CND was absolutely delighted and thrilled that our vice presidents, Jeremy Corbyn and Caroline could represent us in Japan, attending the ceremonies, speaking at the huge rallies in both Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and participating in the World Conference, which brings, delegates together from across the world. So, we've organised this webinar so that you can hear, about their reflections on their visit, what particularly stayed with them, what they took away from the experience, but also on how we can build CND and we can build the critical opposition that's needed to stop this war drive that risks going nuclear. So before I hand over to Jeremy and then to Caroline, just to say we do hope to have time for questions. And so there is a Q&A box. So if you put your questions in there, and then we'll be able to take those hopefully in like 2 batches at the end of their contributions. So that's it from me. I'm now going to hand over to Jeremy, and just to say that it's really wonderful Jeremy's with us. He's in Parliament, and so he is going to have to head off for a quick vote round about 7, but hopefully he'll be joining us again after that. So lovely to have you with us, Jeremy, and over to you.
Sophie, thanks very much. And it was a real honor to be able to go to Japan. And Caroline and I did our best to speak up for peace and so on around the world. And obviously, Caroline speaking next, but from my point of view, it was a deeply moving experience to go to Japan at all, and certainly to go to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I've never been to Japan in my life before. And what hit me before I went was how little understanding there is of Japanese society, politics, or culture in this country. Go into any bookshop and try and find anything about Japan beyond sort of a travel book. That's about it. There's very little on Japanese history. And I think this is a fault that's there. And indeed, when I had a meeting with the Communist Party of Japan, I said they really were, they needed to produce something that informed us a bit more about Japan all the time, and other parties as well. It doesn't have to be them. And that they actually, to be fair, they fully accepted that. And so the visit was wonderful. Um, we lost a day and a half on the way there because our plane got turned back to Heathrow because of a fault. So I got to enjoy a day and a half in Terminal 5. It's a wonderful spot. I recommend it. If you really want to spend a day and a half in Terminal 5, do so. And then we were there after we'd been in Nagasaki. There was this massive storm, so that held us up for 2 days as well. So it was an interesting visit. Um, the visit to Hiroshima was to me a very deeply moving experience because it is a city that was obviously totally destroyed. It is a city that has never forgotten. The museum itself is an amazing experience. It pulls no punches, it hides nothing, and its numbers seem to be up to more than 2 million a year visitors to it. And the commemoration event was huge, quite formal, quite formally organized, and seemed to enjoy the participation of the rest of society. In the run up to it, we had the conference to rid the world of atomic and hydrogen weapons, which took place then. I don't know if Caroline remembers it, but there was one part of it. There was incredible noise going on outside. I didn't know what it was. Went off and asked about it. It turned out to be the Japanese far right, who were assembling a sort of convoy of people waving the old Japanese imperial flag. I've no idea what their views on nuclear weapons were, but I suspect they weren't the same as ours. And that was to me an object lesson in the way the far right are rising all around the world. The
Jeremy,
Yeah,
sorry, is it all right if you can put your headphone thing next to your mouth a bit? It's a bit quiet.
is that better?
Yes, that's much better. Thank
Okay,
you.
I'll try and turn it up a bit. So if I
Sorry to
try.
interrupt.
No, no, don't worry about that. It's fine. It's more important thing is to be heard. So I'll speak a bit louder as well. That might help. And so at the conference, the the really were two parts to it. One was quite correct memory of what happened in Hiroshima in 1945, memory of it from the survivors who were truly wonderful and amazing people, and the horror show it was. And then you have to just keep reminding yourself that this size of the weapon that was used there in 1945 was very, very small compared to any of the warheads that are now available to any of the nuclear armed states. The second part was the message of people from Korea and elsewhere was a very strong one against nuclear weapons. The largest non-Japanese or Korean delegation appeared to be the French. Other delegations were there, but not very big. There was quite a few from the United States, Caroline and us from the UK, and some from Australia and other places. The discussion then moved quite quickly into the Global Ban Treaty away from the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And I think we should be cautious about not building up a difference between the two. In effect, they're actually rowing in the same direction. The NPT has had its successes in the sense of the nuclear weapons free zones of Africa, Latin America, and Central Asia. It's had its failings in the sense it hasn't controlled what the declared nuclear weapon states do, and those such as North Korea, Iran, Israel, India, and Pakistan who have either left it or not signatories to it at the present time. The attendance at Hiroshima was enormous, and most countries were represented there. But I was quite surprised to see that whilst the USA was there, despite what Japanese television had been saying in the run up to it, Russia was not there at the commemoration in Hiroshima, but most other countries were. And then after the Hiroshima event, we moved to Nagasaki. And the Nagasaki event, every country, as far as I could see, that had diplomatic relations with Japan was represented there. And I have to say that the British Embassy was extremely accommodating and helpful, and they were there at both the events and um, gave good advice and so on. I don't know if Caroline had much chance to talk to them, but I spent a bit of time talking to them. I thought they were extremely helpful. In Nagasaki, the conference then was much bigger, or it seemed to me to be much bigger. There were about 3,000 people in the Nagasaki event, which was quite a spirited affair. And the conclusion I got from it was severalfold. One, that it is a certain generation of people around the world that understand what nuclear weapons are about, understand the danger of them, understand the power of them, and in a sense are a generation that, in my case, old enough to remember the Cuban Missile Crisis and others. Younger people were not so well represented and not so well aware of it, although there were young people on the stage performing and doing musical events and so on. And so it seems to me there is a need for a great deal of education to take place on education about what nuclear weapons are about. It is also uh, standing against the trends of the times. If you think about it, there's never been a higher level of expenditure since before the since the Cold War on global weapons. It's now 2.4 trillion globally. That we now have hot wars going on in Ukraine, Gaza, Palestine, Sudan, Congo, Yemen, and other places as well. And we have a global trajectory of spending a great deal more on weapons, and in the case of Britain and the USA particularly, much more on nuclear weapons. There is also a debate going on in Japan about amending the constitution to end their neutrality, to end the restriction on Japanese forces acting out of area. And because Japan has a relationship with NATO as an ancillary member, or whatever they call it, a global partner or something, I think we need to be supportive of the Japanese peace organizations in their campaigns. On the following weekend, after we'd left Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Laura, my wife, and I were still in Japan, and we went to the Japan Women's Association conference in Tokyo, where I presented some CND memorabilia to them and saw some lovely pictures of previous CND visitors to their museum, which was lovely. And Laura made a speech, and I made a speech there. And their determination was to campaign against growing militarism and militarization. And in discussion, we all agreed we should put a huge amount of effort, and I'm sure CND would agree with this, into getting a big global attendance and attention on the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference in New York next May, but also on the Global Ban Treaty and building up some global feelings on this, because it seems to me that if we are not able to turn the corner on levels of militarism and acceptance of the idea that nuclear weapons provide a degree of security when they clearly don't, then we are not succeeding in our duty. Nuclear weapons have now come back to Britain at Lakenheath, and Britain is now developing a new generation of nuclear powered submarines and nuclear weapons, and that is something we have to be campaigning very hard on. And so, what I came back with was a renewed understanding of the horror show that went on in Japan, amazing respect and admiration for the survivors and the way that they spoke, and that wonderful elderly gentleman in Nagasaki who put his arm around me at the social event in the evening and just said, Jeremy, you and all of your friends have got to do everything you can to explain to the world that nuclear weapons never work, only kill, only destroy, and you have to build a world free of nuclear weapons. And I couldn't agree with him more. Caroline made a very strong point in her speech there that we have to do something, and sure she'll come on to this, in the thinking of how we campaign against nuclear weapons, how we involve more people in it, and we don't just talk to each other about it. So it is about developing campaigning ideas of education on nuclear weapons, opposition to militarism, and support for peace processes around the world. Two of the conflicts around the world involve states with nuclear weapons. Russia Ukraine clearly has enormous nuclear resources on either side, NATO's own nuclear resources and Russia's nuclear resources. In the case of Gaza, Israel does have nuclear weapons and threatens Iran, which doesn't have nuclear weapons, but in Israel's belief could have nuclear weapons. The need for serious opposition to the whole idea of nuclear weapons has never been stronger and never been greater. And absolute last point from me. In the case of Britain, the government is trying to cut expenditure on welfare benefits for people with disabilities. It's cutting expenditure on local government and public services, engaged in privatising within the NHS. The only area that's going up is defence expenditure, which ultimately could go up by 13 billion a year more if they fulfil all the NATO requirements. That is devastating. And so it's a pretty clear choice. We either want to spend money on social needs of people or on nuclear weapons. I know which I want. And I'm just so proud that CND has existed for so long, campaigned and worked for so long, and long may that continue, but long may the need not continue, but I suspect it will for a while. So we've got a lot of campaigning work to do, and I'm happy to be part of that campaigning work. Could I just finish by saying thank you to CND for giving me the opportunity of going there. It was, to me, I thought I would not be as affected emotionally by going to Hiroshima and Nagasaki as I was. I've been involved in CND since I was a young teenager, and I never thought it would have the effect on me it did. But just looking at the museum, talking to the survivors, and looking at the cities and what had happened, and of course the victims of the tests all over the Pacific as well as the USA and Asia, it had a big effect on me. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much for, representing CND and also sort of, I suppose, using your platform to be able to raise awareness about exactly, what you heard, what you experienced, and like you say, why we need to be campaigning more than ever. So thank you, Jeremy. Okay, and we'll probably see you in a bit. But now it's real pleasure to introduce our next Vice President, Caroline Lucas, who also attended in Japan, and really looking forward to hearing your reflections. Over to you, Caroline.
Thanks so much, Sophie. And I hope people can hear me all right, because I've been having a bad day with my Wi-Fi, but I think it's more or less fixed. So I hope it is. Yes, and let me just echo Jeremy's huge thanks to CND, because it really was a huge privilege to represent CND at the commemorations. I'd not been to Japan before, and I would really echo what Jeremy said about the kind of the stomach punch it feels like you're having, when you're in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I mean, in spite of all we know about the agonies and the anguish which unfolded, I think nothing can quite prepare you for that gut-wrenching horror of actually being in the city, of hearing the stories directly from the few remaining first generation Hibakusha, the survivors of the atomic bombs, who for years have suffered from not just the radiation sickness and the psychological trauma, but also from stigma and discrimination as well. And I hadn't fully understood, I think, before I heard more from them, just how much discrimination there was. I remember one story about a gentleman who had been prevented from marrying the woman he loved because her parents didn't want her to marry a survivor. So it just the multiple anguish that goes on for generations became really, really clear. And there was a very strong focus in all of the meetings that Jeremy has described on the survivors, because obviously 80 years on, they're not going to be around for very much longer, to put it bluntly. And I felt there was a real strategy to make sure that over the course of the week, we heard as much from them as possible, and they were really given a big platform. And it was clear as well that their message was that, remembering and learning is really important, but it's not enough. And the importance of acting urgently now was obviously a key message that they wanted to to communicate. And you know, something that brought it home to me was when I kind of discovered that, you know, as we were meeting in Hiroshima, the obscene truth is that the world's 9 nuclear armed states have already amassed the equivalent of around, I think, the firepower of nearly 145,000 Hiroshima bombs, clearly enough to destroy the world many, many times over. And as Jeremy has already said, you know, the shameful thing is, of course, that our own government is actively driving that proliferation. The government announcing it would spend this additional 15 billion on the development of new nuclear warheads, as well as purchasing the 12 nuclear capable fighter jets, in clear breach of the non-proliferation treaty. And what also became clear, I think, and we know this, but it was very much the backdrop of our conversation, was that sense of a deeply serious collapse in the world disarmament framework. We've had the US withdrawal from the intermediate range nuclear forces, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Force Treaty, the INF, in 2019, followed by Russia, marking a hugely dangerous moment. And as we also know, some of the key existing international arms control treaties are also under threat or soon to expire. And now the only major nuclear arms control treaty left between the US and Russia is the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty START. But even that is due to expire in February of next year, which potentially leaves them with no kind of limits on their arsenals for the first time in half a century. And as we know, both of them are already pursuing existing extensive modernization programs, spending more and more money on it. I think the US budget for nuclear weapons is now you know, greater than it has been for decades since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Nuclear weapon states signed up to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Again, that treaty is up for review next year. But as we know, they continue to fail in their commitments to take steps to disarm. Far from that being the case, they're actually going in the opposite direction. Weapons are becoming not only deadlier, but also riskier with the integration of nuclear and conventional capabilities, which increase the prospect of miscalculation. And we are sadly not short of potential flashpoints, with Russia repeatedly threatening the use of nuclear war in Ukraine, while India's unprecedented use of the BrahMos cruise missiles in its recent clash with Pakistan, I think, marks a new and dangerous phase in South Asia's so-called strategic balance. So all of that context, I guess, is simply by way of saying that it meant that the discussions at Hiroshima and Nagasaki felt even more important, even more urgent, and the frustration that this wasn't at the top of the agenda of governments around the world even more stark. And if I could just pick out perhaps 2 themes that I was really aware of, in addition to what Jeremy's already said. There was a lot of focus on challenging the flawed concept of deterrence, because as we all know, again and again, you know, the vast and obscene spending on nuclear weapons is always justified by this claim of deterrence. And I was so struck by, here in the UK, the Prime Minister Keir Starmer announcing last month, he actually said that the 15 billion, what he called our sovereign warhead program, of course, neatly overlooking the fact that it can't be used without US support, he said that money was being spent, and I quote, to secure our deterrent for decades to come, part of the historic renewal of our nuclear deterrent as the ultimate guarantor of our safety and security, and investment in British pride and the British people. I mean, what an obscene thing to say, because if our national pride really depends on our ability to destroy the world many times over, then we are more morally bankrupt than perhaps we thought. But this idea of deterrence, the myth of deterrence, I think came under scrutiny in many of the sessions in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And it was pointed out many times that it's an entirely unproven theory, and nor can it be proven, because in logic, you can't prove a negative. That is, that doing something causes something else not to happen. And that a nuclear attack hasn't happened could be the result of any number of other factors, or simply, frankly, of exceptional good fortune so far. But to attribute the absence of nuclear war to nuclear deterrence is to register this kind of false positive, which imbues deterrence with this false sense of efficacy. And several people pointed out that deterrence depends on on an understanding perhaps that human beings will always act rationally, that technology will always work perfectly, that miscalculations will always be avoided. You know, with Trump in the White House and Putin in the Kremlin, are we really saying that we think human beings will always act rationally, that miscalculations will always be avoided? And there was some focus on, and I wish frankly there'd been a bit more focus on, the particular risks now of AI and cyber attacks, because those new and emerging military technologies further heighten nuclear risks, like cyber attacks on early warning systems, for example. So I found the debate on deterrence really helpful, and simply underlining what we all know, that the best deterrence, of course, is to work with other nations constructively to solve the global threats like fossil fuel-induced climate disruption, or the trafficking in weapons and people and drugs, or the poverty and desperation that fuels the conflict and hunger and violence around the world. And the other theme, just quickly to pick up something that Jeremy has already spoken about, which is, of course, the treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons, the TPNW. It really felt like this was going to be such an important moment. There was a huge amount of frustration from the Japanese delegations that their own government hadn't even signed up to be an observer of the TPNW process. And I think that's going to be one of their strategic priorities going forward in Japan, is to press their own government to do that. But it felt like, you know, here is a treaty that half the world's nations have actually signed, and yet, you know, it features nowhere in the UK discussions, certainly. And so it needs to be, picking up on what Jeremy was saying about education, I think we need as many people as possible to know that this treaty actually exists there, that half the world's countries pretty much have already signed it, that we are outliers by not actually being engaged in the process. I suppose a couple of last things to say would be that, you know, this summer's Strategic Defence Review urged the government, this is really shocking, it urged the government to run a PR campaign to convince people of the necessity of a growing nuclear arsenal. And the government has accepted all the recommendations of the Strategic Defence Review, so that means they've accepted this recommendation for a PR campaign. And I think if those of us who find that proposal both morally repugnant and military reckless are to have any success in challenging the government's own PR manoeuvres, then we need to get a lot more serious ourselves about promoting much more citizens' engagement and public education to set out the existential threats posed by nuclear weapons. And I was really encouraged by some recent polling by More in Common, that organisation, which suggested that door is already open with young people, because apparently those between the ages of 18 and 24 already believe that nuclear conflict is the greatest threat to Britain. And I just wanted to point out the chilling irony, really, that the same British government that is now planning glossy new pro-nuclear PR ads is simultaneously trying to shut down great examination of the impacts of those same nuclear weapons. Because, as you probably heard a month or so ago, the UK was one of just 3 countries to vote in the UN against the creation of a UN scientific panel on the effects of nuclear war, a panel which would update our knowledge, including the latest horrific findings about the consequences of a nuclear winter, this kind of planet-wide deep freeze. So the idea that the government would kind of close down our greater understanding about the impacts of nuclear war, even as it accepts this recommendation to have a glossy new PR campaign, I think shows us the kind of challenges we're up against. And so, yes, going forward, we do need to do more in terms of making sure there's more public education, I think, of engaging more young people, building on their growing understanding that this is a massive threat. Maybe thinking more about what we can do to kind of delegitimize nuclear weapons in the way that chemical and biological weapons have been. You know, could we do more to make it really clear that anybody who's thinking of using nuclear weapons is already pretty much a war criminal? Could we be doing more to have a campaign to get nuclear weapons off hair trigger alert, to stop countries having a policy of first use? It feels to me like there are lots of things that we could be doing that could perhaps work towards, obviously, our ultimate aim, which is to have a country that is or indeed a world, that is free of nuclear weapons.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Caroline. And yes, exactly. There is, I think, myself as well, having visited Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it's just such a powerful experience. I think it is, in a way, it's a kind of life-changing experience, and I think it does really kind of galvanize you even more, doesn't it, in terms of the urgency of really sort of shifting the political narrative around, as you say, deterrence, but also of sort of strengthening the support for the international kind of disarmament frameworks that we have. Really, really critical. So really, great to hear from you. So we've now got the opportunity for questions. So we have got, a number that are already been put into the Q&A. If you haven't already put a question in, then now's the time to do it. I'm going to sort of, it's going to be sort of you for a little while, Caroline, with Jeremy kind of going out to vote. And then we'll see how that goes. But I was going to take we've had a number of questions already, so I was going to take those, and then you can kind of answer all of those, some of those, however you feel. So, and I've got,
can help me
sorry.
answer some of them. Sorry, I was just saying I might see if you can help me answer some of them, Sophie, if they're particularly difficult. So we'll work it out between us.
Yes, definitely. So the first one is from Joan Allwright, and she was saying, when you were in Japan, are there still competing narratives there about whether the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was justified? Did you sort of find that when you were there? So, and I suppose in a way, like, Jeremy was slightly talking to that in terms of the rise of the far right there, because certainly when I was there back in 2005, I was really shocked that there were sort of protesters there who were sort of saying that it was right that Japan was bombed, that it kind of deserved it, and really, really kind of shocking, really sort of shocking statements that were being made. So yeah, if you sort of picked up on any of that. So that's kind of one question. And then another is in relation to, like, the sort of the need for education, sort of peace educations within sort of young people. And I can certainly kind of feed in around C&D's peace education work, but so I suppose is the importance of that. And then we've also had a question from Andrew, who's sort of saying, in Britain, how can we kind of promote alternatives to militarism? And so the sort of the examples that he's sort of giving, let me just bring that up. Yeah, so he was sort of saying, in terms of alternatives to militarism, so a well-educated population, decentralized infrastructure, kind of greater self-reliance as a society, the capacity to resist oppression. Those are the sort of things that Andrew was kind of referring to in terms of alternatives to militarism. I mean, certainly, C&D, we would kind of add looking at sort of human security and how are those kind of met. So that was some of those questions, and then it's sort of more of a kind of suggestion, a really good suggestion actually, by David, who's saying, maybe a sort of a briefing by yourself, Caroline, and Jeremy to other parliamentarians would be a good idea in terms of sort of feeding back on your experience of the 80th anniversary events in Japan. So I don't know how you feel about that, but we could sort of maybe start with those. So the different narratives in sort of Japan. So maybe like, you know, a bit more about the kind of the different kind of, you know, political developments there around that are kind of positive and negative around nuclear disarmament. And then yes, a need for, you know, education amongst kind of young people around peace education. This idea of like, you know, how we can kind of promote an alternative to militarism.
Great. Those are my questions. Can you hear me now? Sorry, I don't know how I was. Anyway,
Yep.
yes. So thank you for the questions. And on the first one from Joan, I mean, my experience, and obviously I didn't speak to everybody, but my general experience was that that the view that the bomb brought an earlier end to the war than would otherwise have happened. Some people, I felt that that was still a narrative that some people had, but it felt overall that actually the counter narrative to say that that you know, Japan was very close to being defeated anyway and to surrendering, and actually this was far more about the US trying to show the Russians that they got the bomb and that they wanted to try and stop Russia getting more involved. That was much more the dominant narrative, and so I feel that maybe since Sophie was there 20 years ago, maybe there's a greater understanding, in fact, that the kind of the myths, either that somehow, as Sophie said, somehow Japan deserved it or something dreadful, or that this was, you know, a way of bringing an end to the war more quickly. I think those narratives were being more strongly debunked. I didn't find that being a really current view at the moment. It's still more current. I mean, certainly when I was doing interviews from Hiroshima, I did some radio interviews back in the UK, sort of long distance, and certainly that was put to me several times there. So it feels as if we've still got a job of work to do here. It feels like those people who are pro-nuclear weapons are going to lean on the argument that it was a necessary evil in order to bring a swifter end to the war. And so I think having our evidence marshaled to be able to challenge that will be pretty important going forward. Peace education, I mean, in a second, I would love Sophie to say some more about what CND is already doing in this space, because it is so important. And I know that CND is very involved in peace education in schools, but it just feels to me, you know, even among the generation that is, you know, has gone through school and is already now, you know, studying in colleges or getting their first jobs and so on, it feels there's a real, to me, a lack of understanding of just how serious nuclear weapons are. It feels as if there is that kind of, maybe there's a psychological barrier in other parts of society where people don't want to think about the reality, and therefore, you know, young people just don't grow up knowing about it in the same way that I remember growing up and, you know, seeing the crazy leaflets that told us to get under the table, or some of the really impactful films. And one of the things I was thinking of really was, you know, how important it would be to have the equivalent of a Live Aid concert or a film again, or something in the arts and media that would bring home some of these issues to people in a way that is more accessible than reading, you know, densely packed research papers. I've been reading a book by Mark Linus called 6 Minutes to Midnight. And I don't agree with everything that Mark Linus says, and he is still in favor of nuclear power, which I particularly don't agree with him about. But what he's done in that book is to really update our understanding of just what the serious consequences would be of a nuclear winter, just, you know, just how devastating it would be. And it feels like anyone who has read even a part of that book, you know, would be and should be kind of out on the streets saying this is just obscene. So yes, I would love us to explore not only more peace education in schools, which I know is happening, but also whether we could think of any allies in the arts and media who could do something for us on a bigger scale, because it just feels like we need that wake-up call. You know, it really is the greatest good luck that we haven't had something more awful happening than we have so far. Andrew's question about alternatives to militarism, and yes, I like the suggestions that have already been made. One of the things that I've been thinking about a lot is about NATO, because clearly NATO is a militaristic alliance, and has all kinds of problems, not least a policy of a first use of nuclear weapons. But it feels one of the difficulties of making that public case is the fact that it's an understandable human response to kind of want to be not isolated. And, you know, if I kind of think in my mind about some of the arguments around Brexit, you know, the EU wasn't perfect, and yet people basically understood that being part of the EU made us safer, more secure, and so forth. I mean, I know those arguments do not apply in the case of NATO, but it is harder to make the case for an alternative to NATO without there being one that frankly feels more robust than the situation we have right now. For years, I used to talk about, you know, how we would strengthen instead the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE. And we certainly need to do that, but I think somehow we need to make that a more credible alternative. And, you know, I haven't seen the most recent research that's been done around how you could do that, but I feel that we would be more successful in reining in the militarism of NATO if we had an alternative that didn't feel quite so isolated as simply leaving. And I think something around what would be the alternative body that we would then try and get more countries to join and to join ourselves. And it probably is something based on the OSCE. But again, one of the difficulties is that most people have no idea what that is. So we'd need to think more about that. David's point about will we be doing a debrief in Parliament? Well, I know Jeremy is deeply involved in the cross-party group on nuclear weapons. I used to be the vice chair of that group when I was an MP. I'm sure he will be doing feedback there, and I would certainly be very happy to be involved in any other kind of debriefing that is helpful, because I think there is that sense of a huge responsibility of having been there and seen it for yourself and heard it directly. You know, it just feels that we need to take that out to as many people as we possibly can.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thanks very much. So just to add in a few points there, I mean, certainly I think the whole narrative around all the kind of lies, really, isn't it? It's the sort of the lies to justify the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are still definitely out there. I mean, I'm sure, like, you know, Caroline and Jeremy, when you do sort of radio phone-ins, you know, around the anniversary, people are just will not accept that what they have been told are just lies. They just won't accept it. So it's really hard in terms of trying to unpack that, because I think it's because obviously in relation to all the sort of the propaganda around the sort of the Second World War, and, you know, building up Japan as you know, the enemy, and really not being able to understand that there are people, you know, who lived in Japan and who live in Japan who don't support their governments. You know what I mean? As we have here in Britain, you know, there's sort of, I think there's also, you know, sort of deep-seated kind of racism that has to be unpacked there. But certainly things are shifting, because there's been polling done now that shows that, you know, there is a majority of the population who believe that that it, you know, it was sort of not kind of morally justified for the US to use nuclear weapons on Japan, to sort of, you know, try and sort of stop sort of further deaths. So I think that is sort of that is kind of very significant sort of shift in things. And, you know, I think that the kind of the very thorough academic research that has been done around this is sort of, you know, is definitely kind of being sort of more widely kind of taken up. But also I do feel things like films like Oppenheimer. I mean, this is sort of slightly coming onto the cultural aspect of, you know, of the representation of nuclear weapons I mean, I do feel that that is shifting, and I think films like Oppenheimer certainly raise those questions. You know, like in the film, it's clear that, you know, Germany has been defeated. You know, there's discussion about Japan wanting to surrender. So why are they still accelerating to test these nuclear bombs? So I think, you know, that there are definitely those questions are kind of raised within films like that. And certainly, you know, there is a sort of a kind of growing kind of level of whether it's kind of the type of awareness that we want. Do you know what I mean? In terms of having a proper understanding about the sort of the human cost of nuclear war, which is that's what we need. But there is a kind of a growing level of awareness about the threat of nuclear war and sort of and nuclear weapons. I mean, there are, you know, a lot of books out there now, but also there are sort of a lot of like video games that are very much around kind of sort of post-nuclear apocalyptic worlds and things like that. So there is a kind of a growing kind of level of awareness, but as a, you know, there's still a huge amount that needs to be done in terms of people understanding the reality of sort of nuclear war. And so I totally agree with what Caroline's saying. I mean, I feel like, you know, I mean, what's I think is going to be hopefully very powerful is the fact that Threads, you know, the kind of cult, you know, anti-nuclear film, you know, of the 80s about a nuclear bomb being dropped on Sheffield is going to be made into a, you know, a series, you know, on Netflix. That's the director who did Adolescence. People might know this anyway. So you know what I mean? So that I think could be really sort of significant. The fact that it's a sort of a series as well means that you can really kind of get into the you know, into a lot of kind of detail and understanding about that. So I think that would be that's something, you know, that we should definitely promote very widely. Then just as Jeremy's back, I'm just going to keep it brief, just in terms of C&D's peace education work. So we've been doing this for, you know, very many number of years now, and it's an award-winning, you know, piece of work that we do. You know, a lot of our kind of lesson plans, you know, are very, very popular, very successful. You know, we're working with hundreds of schools. So we, you know, we provide lesson plans and resources for teachers, and this is all about like young people developing critical thinking around foreign policy, around nuclear weapons, you know, exactly as Caroline says about this whole, you know, idea about deterrence, you know, so that's really what it's about. One of the lesson plans is Truman on trial. So, you know, President Truman, who made the decision to, you know, to drop the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Let's look at, like, you know, whether he was right or not. You know, that's one of the sort of the lessons that young people are kind of involved in. So it's a really, really important piece of our work. Probably we need to promote it a lot more. It's absolutely vital that this work is happening, especially given what the government is planning. As you know, we've seen in the Strategic Defence Review, and a much closer integration between the Ministry of Defence and Department for Education to really, really kind of push, you know, sort of army cadets, and just this whole idea of kind of militarism. So yes, it's really, really vital work that we're doing. So anybody out there who wants to kind of volunteer to kind of promote our peace education work in schools, you know, who can sort of deliver workshops, like do message us and do kind of get in contact. So as Jeremy's back, I'm just going to just highlight some of the questions that Caroline was feeding in on, and also we've had some more in, so I'll kind of pick up those as well. But we had this kind of question from Andrew in relation to what in the UK can we be doing to kind of promote an alternative to militarism. You know, I know Jeremy's kind of been involved in promoting the Alternative Defence Review that was sort of funded by the RMT and, you know, supported by C&D, a really, really important piece of work that's really kind of looking and focusing on, you know, how we can reduce our our military sort of footprint, and how we can be kind of looking at the real sort of human security that we should be focusing on. So that might be something that you want to focus on, Jeremy. But then also the fact that we still are having to challenge these kind of lies about the fact that the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was necessary in order to end the war. And if you kind of picked up those kind of narratives in Japan, that's certainly the case across the West, isn't it, that we're still having to challenge that. So, and then we kind of we've also had some questions in relation to kind of NATO. Yes, CND does support the withdrawal of NATO membership. We've had other questions about, like, what do people think about the fact that we don't have there aren't kind of political parties that are kind of anti-NATO. I mean, Caroline was saying, can we kind of open up this discussion around NATO? So, to look at what are the alternatives. She was sort of talking about the OECE, is that a kind of possibility? So those are the kind of areas that we have come up in terms of questions. So I don't know if any of those are something you'd like to address.
Who, me or Caroline?
You, Jeremy.
Okay, thanks. Sorry, I had to pop out and just vote, but I'm back now in my office. The first thing is that in the museum in Hiroshima, they say in terms, and this is to me impressive, they say in terms that the dropping of the nuclear bomb on Hiroshima was the first bomb of the Cold War, not the last bomb of the Second War, the first bomb of the Cold War. Very important point, I think, that's made. And what you were saying, Sophie, is absolutely right, that as again was recorded in the museum, it was quite clear that there was very advanced negotiations going on for a Japanese ceasefire in 1945 that was going to come to fruition within a few days. And so this thirst to drop the nuclear bomb was either just they wanted to prove they could do it, or they wanted to show the Soviet Union they could do it, one way or the other, even though Russia was involved in trying to broker the arrangement for a Japanese surrender at that time. So, but also the narrative is sort of kept going by the BBC and others. And on August the 6th, the BBC Today program had a whole long thing about it. And I didn't hear it, but I understand there was a very good contribution by a survivor in Japan. I don't know who it was, but there was a very good contribution. And then the BBC then went over to Ben Wallace as a former defense secretary who defended the use of nuclear weapons. The BBC knew perfectly well that Caroline and I were both in Hiroshima and both going to be in Nagasaki. And I don't know how many other parliamentarians have been to the commemoration before. Maybe some have, maybe they haven't. I don't know. But I just thought it a bit odd that they didn't invite either of us onto their program when we could have actually given a direct message from there as to what was going on. On the other points that have been made, yes, I think the CND Alternative Defence Review is an absolutely brilliant document, very well researched, very well written, and gives real opportunity to debate and develop that alternative. And I do think that we need to have some forum for discussing the need for a peace dialogue around the world, which is sadly lacking. And also the points that I think Caroline was making when I was out about NATO expansion, and that has gone on ever since 2006. Well, it's gone on for a long time, but particularly then, which involves countries, including Japan, having an associate status with NATO. And so, what is the alternative? The alternative in Europe is the OSCE. The OSCE ought to have been the organization that took center stage in the 1990s and could yet be the organization that helps to broker some kind of halt to the hostilities in Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia, and hopefully would be able to monitor some kind of ceasefire, if not a long-term peace, but anything's got to be better than what's going on at the moment. As to NATO expansion, NATO membership, I have always been very skeptical about NATO and very strongly opposed to its expansion. And we need to develop policies which are an alternative to NATO, and an alternative being a development of peace options, power of the UN, power of the OSCE, rather than NATO, because the government, the British government, Starmer particularly, always presents NATO as being the holder of the keys to world peace. It's complete nonsense. What NATO is doing is driving up arms expenditure all around the world, and that then has, of course, a knock-on effect of arms expenditure rising in Russia, China, India, and elsewhere. And in the book that we produced through the Peace and Justice Project, The Monstrous Anger of the Guns, we just exposed the level of spending that the NATO provisions are encouraging. And whilst I said at the beginning it was 2.4 trillion this year, it's likely to go up to 3 trillion and rising. And we need that debate about an alternative. And so anything we can do on that, we'd absolutely do. And certainly through the yourparty.uk, we will be developing peace options and peace alternatives. We haven't actually had a founding conference yet, so I can't tell you what the policy is, but certainly if I have anything to do with it, it'll be an absolutely, and I'm sure it will be, a policy of peace and disarmament and a very strongly anti-nuclear policy.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much. To both of you. I mean, unfortunately, we've kind of we're out of time now. But there are lots and lots of questions that sort of come in. I'm sorry we haven't been able to answer all of them. But thanks so much to everybody for taking part in this this webinar. Thank you so much, Caroline and Jeremy. You know, really wonderful to hear your insights. I mean, hopefully, you know, lots of people on this call are already kind of very active, and I hope that you feel like even more galvanized to take action. There is lots going on. There's lots that we're doing. We're going to put some links in the chat shortly in terms of things that you can do. I mean, we have got a beautiful t-shirt that Jeremy has certainly modeled for us, and Caroline has one now, so we're looking forward to that. You know, buy that. That would be really great. We have an appeal. It'd be really brilliant if people can donate to our No More Hiroshima's appeal to raise money for CND. If you're not already a member of CND, please do join. Really, really important. And then finally, I want to plug 2 demonstrations that are coming up. On Saturday, really, really important demonstration for Palestine against the horrific genocide that's ongoing, and now the horrors of what looks like a ground invasion that's going to be taking place. You know, absolutely horrific situation there. So we really want everybody to be out on the streets on Saturday. Look out for CND's banner. You can march with us. Look out for our stall. You know, come and talk to us. Help give out our placards and leaflets and what have you. That would be really wonderful. And then also one final plug is for Saturday, the 20th of September. That's part of the week of action against Trump's state visit. So CND has got a demonstration at RAF Lakenheath. This is where these US nuclear bombs are now based, putting us all on the nuclear front line. So we're calling for Trump to take his nuclear weapons back with him. He's not welcome here, nor are his nuclear weapons. There are lots of options for you kind of traveling there. There's coaches going from London and Oxford and Norwich. There's a shuttle bus going from the local station. So check out our events website just to sort of get all that information. But the most important thing is, you know, for you to kind of be involved, you know, if you can get more involved. And so help us to build that, you know, that future that we need, a peaceful and nuclear free world. Thanks very much, everybody.
Can I make a quick announcement, Sophie?
Yes, of course, Jeremy.
Very,
Yes,
very
yes,
quickly.
yes.
Absolutely support your point about the demonstration on Saturday, and I'll be there as well. I tried a private members bill for an inquiry into British government policy on Gaza, which was blocked by the government. So we've set up an independent public inquiry into British policy on Gaza, taking place in Church House, Westminster, on Thursday and Friday of this week. It's all online on YouTube and elsewhere, and you can access it through Peace and Justice Project. And if I may, Sophie, I'll pass it on to you, and perhaps you could put the advert up on the CND website as well, and so the way people can join it. And there will be legal experts and others putting their point of view on the breach of international law and the horror story of what's going on in Gaza, and in particular the issues of arms sales and the use of RAF criteria on this. And so I'll send that over to you, and if you can put it up, that'd be very, very helpful. And so again, thank you ever so much, and I hope people will join CND if they're not members, and above all, let's be peace campaigners.
Wonderful.
Here.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, both. Lovely to see you. And thank you for over 200 people joining us today. Well over 200 people. Thank you. All right then. Bye-bye all.
Bye.